现在看来，在我如果教的，我下次参加会有什么好事情？他就I plan an activity for my baby. Okay. Sorry. I'm trying. Thank you. Yes, and if you like to my university from practice, I have to.
Last time I did Peking
So I'm going to my
maybe my ambassador in Beijing can do it.
Yeah.
My ambassador in Beijing, right?
So I'm the maybe you can introduce yourself.
The trade panel will be starting in 5 minutes at 3:20.
Thank you so much. So thank you. So you can see
Yes.
Okay.
was crazy with great reactions. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw the bio. Yeah, so that's although I covered this actually from one of the they sort of teach us sort of like global macro force. I do a course on Asian economies, and I do a course on sort of China markets. So over time, exactly. So it's weird is I get pulled into a lot of this from the other. Economics. Although no, I'm a political scientist by training, but I teach it. I also do I do a management strategy course on doing business in Asia. So I take out like a couple years it's kind of like economics is relevant and technical, and then like a lot of people teach. It's like the skill set to teach it is a little bit different than for research. So somehow I sort of, oddly enough, it sort of ended up sort of being a comparative advantage teacher. Oh yeah, so I was on what's called the Varieties of Capitalism School, so how business starts by concept. Yeah, literally. So how does governance, finance, country? I got pulled into business school because I could kind of talk about, rather than just tell stories, what's it like to do business in countries. Originally, I was more sort of Germany and Japan, and countries, and then just slowly, like all the other things, got pulled to Singapore and China. And so the course I teach, it's like, let's say it's 1/3 pure macro, 1/3 trade theory, and then 1/3 the currencies, globalization, financial crisis, kind of that stuff. So obviously it's just all of these kind of overlap with the sort of thing. And obviously, I think it's easier for you today.
Yeah. Well, I used to
The Wi-Fi's got much better.
Slide this over. All right, so thank you all for coming to our final panel. Today we'll be discussing trade relations between the US and China, the development of the Chinese economy, and impact on the US as the Chinese economy develops. I'm Armand Smigelski, your moderator, senior at Tufts University, and associate editor at the Tufts Daily. We're joined today by two professors with immense expertise in international trade and the Chinese economy, Joseph Foudy and Jonathan Brookfield. Professor Foudy is a clinical associate professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. He teaches courses and conducts research on a wide variety of topics, including Chinese business and society, globalization and its impact on national systems, and economic thought. He's been interviewed and his writings have appeared on various news networks, including CNN, Fox, PBS, NPR, and the New York Times. He received his PhD from Cornell University. Professor Brookfield is an associate professor of strategic management and international business at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He teaches courses on strategic management, political economy and the business environment in Greater China, and on business groups within Asia. He has taught in Taiwan at National Chengchi University and has published numerous articles on Asian business networks. He received his PhD from the Wharton School. So we're going to have some opening remarks from both these professors, have a few questions, and then we'll open the floor to audience questions. Thank you. If you'd like to start.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
There we go. I just since we're talking about it, I thought particularly when we're talking about One Belt, One Road, issues like that, just to sort of take advantage of some visuals. As many of you are intimately familiar, the sort of ambitions that China has in this regard are pretty vast because it's not just connecting Central and Southeast Asia, but ultimately this could be a series of linkages to parts of Africa as well. You get a sense of that on just any of the sort of the maps you can conventionally see that are put out there. So you can see why it was so relevant to the Singaporean Foreign Ministry from your keynote speaker, as well as just many groups in the region. As we talk about it, it's really two routes in one. One is through Central Asia, and the other is going to be a sea route. Not all these routes are created equal. there's a sort of natural economic move to sort of incorporate Southeast Asia, just look at Chinese demographics and the need for markets. That makes natural sense. The sea route may actually end up being the most consequential in that a lot of Chinese companies are looking to East Africa, countries like Kenya, for long-term, not natural resources, but actually investing in potentially factories as 2 generations of the one-child policy starts to sort of age Chinese society and reduce the workforce. I'm a little more skeptical on some of the new Eurasian land bridge. When I look at the size of the countries, the stands, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, in terms of markets, I'm just not sure that they're ultimately able to support that much vis-a-vis China. So you see plenty of investment there, but what comes from it, I'm not so sure. From a selfish perspective, this is what I'm really hoping for, which is just to be able to go to and from China and Singapore, stopping at any other countries in between without ever having to go to an airport. We'll see if that actually happens. But you can imagine one day having a series of high-speed networks that integrates the entire region. You see countries that are next to each other, but they're really quite fragmented if you actually try to drive or connect any of them physically. Who's ever been to Vietnam? From North to South Vietnam, it's like going from San Diego to Seattle. Right? Have you been to Hanoi? Have you been to Saigon? How'd you get there? Yeah. Because the train is going to be a 24-hour train ride, or sometimes I think 48, kind of like Amtrak. No, and so there's real potential there, and you can see how that actually could transform southern China, where wages have gone up and up, to create sort of a near abroad for Chinese factories as well as for Chinese markets. This fits into what I call the acronyms wars that you were hearing about before. So the AIIB to me is really just an attempt for, first of all, China to get international prestige and respect. As we heard before, the head of the World Bank has always been an American. The head of the IMF has always been a European. The head of the Asian Development Bank historically has been dominated by Japan. China actually quite patiently said, we'd like you to reform these organizations to give us more of a role and voice. We were slow to. So they created the AIIB. And in that sense, this could actually have a really important impact just in terms of the sheer amount of money that's involved. From a US perspective, they view this as competition. But if you think about the fact that there are 1 billion people in poverty across Asia, parts of Africa, this program could be transformative to them, and we shouldn't be petty. Right? If it is a fight, the US obviously lost the first round in terms of the AIIB. The US and Japan sat it out, but all of our major allies across the world joined. The real issue is actually TPP. TPP was meant to be an economic set of relationships that would tie the United States, Southeast Asia together. Some in China viewed this as an attempt to sort of contain or ensnare it, and I think to an extent that's true. They might have been doing this in sort of polite ways, but this was an attempt to integrate countries with the United States, to give them bargaining power, and to sort of reassure them about a US role in Asia. And walking away from that, I can't underestimate the sort of immense psychological blow that is to people's confidence in the United States. Then, of course, they sort of announced we might be going back in. I did an op-ed. CNBC had called us and asked me to do something. And as always happens with the Trump administration, as soon as you make any comment, 2 hours later, something changes. But I've been trying to talk about what was happening within foreign policy terms in Asia. And then I see the same day we're debating rejoining TPP. The US, I'll just tell you, like much of the world, all trade agreements are unpopular. They're unpopular in both political parties. The only people who support trade agreements are elites, and elites in the United States don't matter right now. We focus on that on the right with President Trump, but it's broadly true on the left with people like Bernie Sanders. The irony, of course, is TPP was one of the few trade agreements, right, in which the effects on the United States would have been relatively muted in terms of jobs. A lot of TPP was taking goods that would have come from country X and diverting it to come from country Y, as opposed to moving U.S. jobs abroad. We'll see if the U.S. rejoins it and what it ultimately looks like. But again, its motivation was to sort of reassure countries, tie them economically together with the United States, and then eventually, if it's an attractive trading bloc, offer China to join, but use that as a sort of lever or pressure point to get China to open up. We tried to do this with WTO membership, and we only had sort of limited success. Similarly, why is China engaged in the One Belt, One Road initiative? The most commonly heard things, and they're all true, that you'll hear is, first of all, it's a foreign policy tool to increase influence. Don't kid yourself. If you think back to any of the discussions from President Xi about his China dream, China would like to increase its influence in the world. It's rapidly approaching parity with the United States if it's not already there in terms of world GDP. Certainly in Asia, it sees itself as a sort of co-equal power. And this is a tool to get countries to give China some of the respect and influence that it feels it deserves. It's also meant to obviously develop foreign markets. China has a lot of goods that it'd like to export. Its Chinese exports as a percentage of GDP are set to decline. The Chinese domestic economy is growing more rapidly than other economies. Who in this room has been to a Kmart or a Walmart in the last year? How much more will you buy this year than you bought last year? The average US company, think about a McDonald's, think about a Kmart, think about a Walmart, think about a Gap store. You see about 1 to 2% increase in same-store sales. Chinese economy is growing at 6%. China can't grow by exports anymore, just because the rest of the world is growing more slowly than it is. So it's actively looking for new markets for its goods and services. That requires infrastructure investments to get there. It has to find countries that it hasn't already tapped. So that's often what we see in discussions or newspapers. It's also obviously a long-standing strategy to get raw materials and energy security. China has a number of natural resources. Look at things like rare earth elements. It's still dependent on foreign oil, iron, a number of commodities. And so these are all attempts to increase its access points and its security. Having made all of those points, I would still say to you, there's an overlapping strategy. Both sets of explanations are true. That really focuses in on the Chinese domestic economy and some issues it faces. First of all, China has excess capital. It has a very high domestic savings rate. That hasn't changed. China is running out of investment opportunities domestically. This is sort of one of the core challenges China has faced for the last 5 years. Debt to GDP in China is skyrocketing. Right? One reason debt to GDP is skyrocketing is Chinese households save a great deal of money. That money has to flow somewhere. Right? All money has to flow somewhere. Every dime that's put in a Chinese bank has to go somewhere. For many years, it went to the United States. They lent us money. We took that money. We bought their goods. Right? If the United States can't take that money, it has to go to another country. Another country doesn't take it, it'll feed a real estate boom in China and you get a bubble. Shut down the Chinese real estate market, you get a stock bubble. So I teach business, but I come from a sort of an economics department. We have a saying in finance. Banks don't get into trouble for having too little money. Banks get into trouble for having too much money. Because when you have too much money, you struggle to find places to invest it, you get careless, and then you have too little money. Right? So think in 2008, in response to the global financial crisis, China built a series of high-speed rails. They built new airport terminals across the country. Right? To grow in 2009, they had to match the same level of investment. And of course, as China grows at 10% a year, everything you build, you have to build 10% more. Right? You build 10 skyscrapers in a city in year 1, it's 11 in year 2, 12 in year 3 with compounding. So it just gets harder and harder to find places to invest in. So one piece of the One Belt, One Road initiative is to find a place to take this excess capital and invest abroad. It's to find somewhere to put the money, right, before it causes further distortions in the domestic economy. I mentioned China's workforce is aging. It's going to hit a point in the next 5 or 10 years where the working age population peaks and then comes down. But it's not there yet, and it's simultaneously transitioning from an economy about making things, construction, iron, steel, roads, bridges, dams, right? High-speed rail, to innovation. Right? The workers that you require for innovation are very different than the workers you need for construction. So this is also a way to sop up some of the excess labor you're going to see in China for people who have sort of blue-collar or working-class skills, people who did not go to college. How much that can matter, I'm skeptical. But those are motivations. Only because China is a country of 1.3 billion people. Right? So if you think about that, if the workforce in China is 800 million, you take 8 million people, that's knocking 1% out of GDP. You're never going to send 8 million people abroad. There are now 1 million Chinese, actually over 1 million, probably closer to 1.5 for all I know, that live in Africa alone. China is such a big country that no matter what it does in terms of sending excess resources or moving population abroad, it remains a rounding error domestically. Last piece, and I don't want to stress this too much, obviously this is a tool to gain sort of a greater role for the RMB in international markets. The RMB is not a major world currency, despite being sort of in the IMF special drawing rights. That's actually not due to anything other than the fact that China has currency controls. As soon as China eliminates currency controls, the RMB will become a major world currency. In the meantime, however, internationalization is a way to increase that profile until China finds it in its interest to do so. Long term, it wants to grow the role of its currency. It wants to liberalize its financial system. It wants to impose market discipline on its banks. But in the short term, it needs to do that very, very slowly. This is Chinese savings and investment, and I'll just tell you, savings equals investment. If it doesn't for a country, you have a trade deficit or you have a trade surplus. So every day I go through this oddity of talking about tariffs and protectionism. Right? But at the end of the day, there's one simple explanation for the United States trade deficit. It is precisely equal to the gap between domestic savings and investment. This last year, the United States government cut taxes and dramatically increased spending. We're forecast to have $1 trillion government budget deficit. Where are we going to get that money? You buy it domestically, you crowd out US firms, they go abroad. Right? Or we just go to China, Germany, Japan, Norway, lots of other countries. Right? Every dollar of deficit that you have to finance somehow. So we see that's actually true of all countries. China, by the way, for the longest period has had an equal but opposite problem. Whereas Americans spend money like drunken sailors, right? Chinese save too much. So China and the US, oddly enough, for the last 30 years have been yin and yang. Our strengths are their weaknesses, their strengths are our weaknesses. Perfectly paired together actually as two countries. Right? If the United States had balanced its budget 10 years ago, China would have had a crisis because the US is still a big importer of Chinese goods. Right? Had China sort of had domestic savings equal to domestic demand, the US would have had an even bigger crisis. Right? We would have just had a shortage of capital, interest rates would have shot up, it would have had profound implications. Chinese steel capacity. This is capacity, this is production, right? That's consumption. Right? So China is exporting steel because there's not enough domestic consumption. But look at the excess that's in that system. You see it slowly coming down. But the excess production of steel in China, the excess number of factories in China producing steel, is equivalent to the entire production probably of Europe and the United States. It's just the global glut of steel, right? If the United States refuses to take Chinese steel, it'll get dumped somewhere else. That country will try to dump into the US. You need to bring that down. Why don't you? Very simply, every one of those steel plants employs thousands of people. They can employ 5,000, 10,000 people. Right? Who's the party secretary of a town in China that wants to raise their hand and say, shut my factory down? Right? It's like the dean calling up and saying, we need to be tough on our students. I go, you're absolutely right. Tell all of those other professors to be tough on their students. Right? No, and so you look at these numbers, that is a difficult nut to crack. This is feeding into a lot of the inefficiencies of the Chinese system. And One Belt, One Road and its trade policies are a function of that. I'll also say to you, there are long-term political risks. Lots of the money you lend abroad, you don't get repaid. That's life. Talk to the World Bank. Actually, talk to the IMF. Right? China has lent a great deal of money to Venezuela from the Venezuelan perspective. How much money is China ever going to get back from Venezuela? Nothing. No, for China, it's a rounding error. It doesn't matter. But it's symbolic of the fact that when you invest abroad, you're going to have to write off a lot of these investments. And if you think that's your solution to economic imbalances, you should be skeptical. One quick focus. This is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. This is really significant because it can link Western China through Pakistan. It gives China access to a port, right? That's not tied in with all of its resources on the east of China, where a lot of these foreign policy issues are. This is also a series of roads and other connections that will allow China to sell goods in Pakistan. Is this project good for China? Absolutely. Is this project good for Pakistan? I mean, if you think about this, Pakistan is
is China is lending Pakistan money, perhaps at a favorable interest rate, but with interest, that Pakistan then uses to pay China with Chinese workers to develop projects in Pakistan, including road and infrastructure that will allow China to bring goods into Pakistan to sell there. China is lending money to Pakistan for Pakistan to pay China to build infrastructure to help China sell goods in its country. No, in a lot of ways, that's going to, people in Pakistan are aware of this. Pakistan, though, has foreign policy tensions with India, doesn't exactly get along with the Trump administration, so it has no choice but to take that money because China is its only friend. But, you know, when the bill comes due, you're going to see, just like you saw with lots of U.S. investments and operations abroad, that sort of these relationships will breed resentment, just like we've seen with the U.S. or anywhere else. And so lots of people in Pakistan are aware of the fact that there's going to be a bill come due, and there's a risk that you're going to hollow out your own economy. I teach on Latin America as well. Chinese growth has been good for Latin America. Latin America has sent record commodity exports. That's made a number of countries wealthy to China. But of course, cheap Chinese goods have wrecked Latin American manufacturing. Manufacturing output as a percentage of GDP has declined in almost every country in Latin America. You also have cases, this is a skeptical view, but it's from, of course, India, which loves to sort of focus on Pakistan and things it might make. And it points out correctly that there are lots of cases where China loans countries money they can't pay. Sri Lanka is an example of one. And instead, China basically wrote off the debt in return for a port. China has a 99-year lease on it. So Sri Lanka did get the infrastructure. They're going to get employment. But, you know, that looks to a lot of people like neo-colonialism. We pushed the British out. Now we may have to deal with somebody else. No, and so whether it's fair or unfair, this is going to create real foreign policy tensions for China over time. Just natural human behavior, the more successful someone is, the more you tend to breed resentment. It's a sad irony, but the more sometimes you help people, you'll see this in your personal life, sometimes the more passive-aggressively they resent you. That's why I just don't help anybody. This is too harsh, the notion that somehow it's doomed to fail, but I'll just tell you, Japan faced a similar challenge 20 years ago. China is much bigger than Japan. I'm much more bullish on Japan, on China than I am on Japan. But they had the same aging demographic, and they realized, what can we do? They had a huge trade surplus with the US or elsewhere. They took that money and they invested across Southeast Asia. Right. Go to Singapore, an enormous number of the malls and real estate. Operations in Indonesia. I go to Vietnam with students. You go to Saigon, the subway being built with Japanese money. Right? And at the time, by the way, we had the same kind of fears you sometimes hear about China. This is a great book by two academics that I know well from their previous research, talking about how it's going to be Asia and Japan's embrace, and that they're using all of their money to build a series of production facilities and infrastructure to pay off for Japanese companies across Asia, and this will give them influence. This was Japan's One Belt, One Road initiative, although since it was an island, it was nothing but a maritime sea route. And obviously that did not solve or help cure any of the domestic imbalances. So as a tool of foreign policy, in summary, I think this could be really effective. This is going to be transformative to many of the countries. I think most countries are cynical in their foreign policy. China is extremely cynical in its foreign policy. It's amoral. Not immoral or wrong, it's just practical. China doesn't do anything out of being magnanimous. You could, if you want to be critical, you could say the same thing if you want about the U.S. So it will actually help these countries, but I don't think it's necessarily going to get goodwill, and it's certainly not going to actually alter anything in the Chinese domestic economy. China is 20–25% of GDP. All of the countries it's targeting in this particular case, it's just like we heard with TPP from the ambassador. You know, that's another 10 or 15%. So China's domestic issues will never really be solved by any of this. That was my quick points.
All right. Thank you. And now Professor Brookfield is going to make some opening remarks as well.
right? There are a lot of interesting parts to the story. Part of it is interpretive, and then part of it is just trying to understand the phenomena that are out there. And so what I thought, if we're thinking really about China's economic influence in the world, China's growing influence in the world, it might be nice to sort of see what that looks like, at least in the numbers a little bit. There, I've done my job now. We're good. If you're trying to really understand, that rising economic influence, I mean, there are different charts, different numbers you can put, but if you're thinking about the international influence and your panel is trade, then probably you could do worse than just look at things over time. And just to give a sense of magnitudes, if you're looking at the beginning of the 90s, that's about 100 billion total trade, imports and exports from China to the rest of the world. And if you're looking at 2013, you're looking at something more like 4 trillion. What kind of magnitude is that? That's more than an order of magnitude larger. That's really more like 40 times larger. If you're kind of wondering, how is it that China has such economic influence, both regionally in Asia and increasingly around the world, these are the numbers. This is what's driving it. I mean, you think about what China was like in the early 90s. I can do that. I was there. Increasingly, it's not always the case. And then you look at what the conversations are like today, and it's that orders of magnitude change in China's economic clout. That's what really makes the difference. We can unpack it a little bit, right? If we were looking at the first chart, that was total trade, China over time, imports plus exports. This is breaking it down in terms of a U.S. perspective. We're at Fletcher. We're in the United States. So if you're thinking about economic relations, and especially if the overarching theme for this weekend's conference is sort of confrontation and cooperation, then that's probably worth thinking about it from a bilateral perspective. This is what it looks like from the United States. Over time, in some ways, there is a problem with looking at longitudinal data. If you see growth rate, it all begins to look the same. It starts small, if you don't discount, it looks big at the end, and that's true. There are some useful things to notice along the way. First is 1985. That's roughly the last year when the U.S. had a bilateral trade in goods balance with the PRC that was in balance. So that was a few years ago, a couple of decades ago. And then it goes for a while, if you're looking at milestones, small in the 80s, not all that big in the 90s, but eventually you begin to see numbers that are large and meaningful. Broke 100 billion in 2002. Most recently, it's about 375 billion. That's the bilateral trade deficit in goods between the United States and China. Along the way, there've been a series of arguments. When the U.S. initially had a bilateral trade deficit with China, the argument was there's no point in having this conversation. What really matters economically in terms of international issues is not the bilateral balance, it's the overall trade surplus or deficit of a country. That's what's more meaningful. Sometimes you're going to be up in some countries, down in other countries. It's when you aggregate it all together, that's when you really begin to get a sense of how to understand an economy and its situation in the world. Fair enough. This is looking at imports and exports, not just between the United States and China, but this is looking at China globally. Some of the read feel very much the same, right? I mean, this is what we heard in the first presentation. That significant growth is there, it's dramatic. Some mild differences. On a worldwide basis, economists in the late 80s, they were right. bilateral balance in China, between China and the United States, was negative for the United States, but on a worldwide basis, basically in balance. It wasn't really until 1994 that the world saw a persistent imbalance in trade in goods with China. Before that, sometimes it was up, sometimes it was down. On the whole, it was just small. What you can see now over time is that balance has clearly gotten more significant. Last couple of years, there are a little bit of changes, right? I mean, 2008, we heard earlier, 2008, 2009, the American financial crisis, that was big in the United States. It had clear implications around the world, and I think we might say continues to. There have been a few books written saying, hey, the system worked, it's over. It's not over. We're still feeling, and we haven't felt all of the repercussions of what happened there. In some ways, you might say we're living in a worldwide financial la-la land. Eventually, things will get clear, but they don't have to happen all that fast. There are. If you think about, we talked about the Japan example. The point there is very relevant. There are things that if you were keeping close accounting, might cause a company to go insolvent or bankrupt, but governments control actually their reporting of financial systems, of banks, etc. If you can control the flow of information, you can actually push things off for years and years and years. Banks are very temperamental creatures, and if you don't watch them like a hawk, all sorts of malfeasance can get into them. And in truth, no one need be the wiser, at least for years, sometimes decades. In a way, you could sort of say that's what happened in Japan. They got to a certain point where the wasteful investment was beginning to catch up. They had to come with a solution. In some countries, that solution comes through a financial crisis. In Japan, they said, no, we're not going to go that direction. And so they spent basically a decade, 2 decades in kind of economic stagnation, slowly behind the scenes trying to fix the problem that had been initially exposed in the mid-'80s. So that's why some say that kind of investment-led economy, when you're in that situation and you get to points like with China, where traditionally most economies in the world, if you compare consumption relative to investment, consumption's about 2/3, investment's about 1/3. It's a rough rule of thumb. In the last couple of years in the PRC, they're inverted. Investment's about 2/3, consumption is about 1/3. And so that's why some people will say there needs to be a rebalancing in China because things are just a little bit out of whack. Timing matters. Probably the leading proponent of that argument is kind of Michael Pettis, academic. He sees significant tension, but that's also because he puts what I might see as a somewhat artificial timeline on when things have to come back into balance. If you give yourself a little bit more time, then the possibility of a softer adjustment opens up. But this is part of it, right? Because if you're thinking about China's rising economic influence, there are really 2 pieces to it, right? There's the tail of the tape. There's the history. That's understanding how we got to where we are. And then there's the second part, which is trying to understand what we think the future is going to be like as well. And that future is awfully important, right? Because the shadow of the future is going to inform the kinds of decisions both companies and countries make today. It's uncertain, but it doesn't mean it's unimportant. All right. If those numbers look, especially get to the edge, a little bit gloomy because we're talking about persistent trade deficits both on the United States side and on the worldwide side with China, that has a certain amount of gloom to it. But there's variance in this whole story, and that leads me to the question. All right, let's flip it around for a second. Are there any countries in the world that run a trade surplus with China? We talk about the United States and a significant deficit. Let's flip it around. What about surplus countries? Where do we go to look for surplus countries in the world? Anyone have a sense? Where should we go? Country examples, thoughts? Where's it goose egg? Everybody's deficit. Yeah. Or maybe Japan. Okay, Japan's a possibility. Other spots, and then that makes sense because you're thinking Japan's a high-tech country, and if China's export profile has been traditionally more labor-intensive goods, then maybe there's a complementarity. And in fact, as China builds out its industrial infrastructure, because part of the big process, the big set of decades-long change in Chinese industrialization, that a country that builds capital equipment, builds machines, they may actually do pretty well under that system. And Japan, being a neighbor, might be doing particularly well. So Japan makes sense. Other thoughts?
Australia.
Australia, okay. And the logic there?
It's a export of minerals to.
Okay. So if one is sort of a high-tech story, then we've got Australia as kind of a natural resource story. If China's going to industrialize, it still needs raw materials. If you're looking in terms of energy or iron ore or something along those lines, a country like Australia might fit the bill. Yep. Bangladesh. Help me out on Bangladesh. It's in the region, so part of it is like, well, maybe you're going to be successful because you're nearby, so that makes it a little easier. Tell me more about Bangladesh.
The labor's now cheaper than China's.
Okay, so it's part of the evolution of the story potentially, which is that what we're thinking about it in our mind is the archetype is China as cheap labor-intensive goods, and that's its success in manufacturing, which has led to such a broad manufacturing sector. But looking forward, they're moving upstream. They're going to be in higher value-add businesses. As they do that, some other countries, Italy's already felt the effect, and other European countries are going to hurt. Some of maybe the mid-level little dragons like a South Korea or Taiwan perhaps will feel some pressure. But then that will open up a new space with labor-intensive Bangladesh. Is it there? Yep.
I'm thinking one of the oil economies, Russia definitely exports a lot of natural gas and oil, and Saudi Arabia probably doesn't import that many manufactured goods from China.
Okay, so if Australia is more thinking about like iron ore, then energy exports are going to be another part of the story. I think those are fair. Those are fair. And so I just throw this up here because, and you'll see, I mean, common sense can go a long way. It's not always common, but it can be helpful. Right? Australia, there it's right up there. Number 4, Brazil, like in Australia, but in the Americas. Japan and Germany, we heard that story here. They're in there. Not as large as I thought, though. Actually, I mean, this is 2016 data, so you're looking at about 16 billion. I thought for more, and I think they have been more at times. But this is again emblematic of China's moving up value chain, moving to higher price point, higher quality products, beginning to put pressure. Also, if you see your growth as being more steady state than accelerated, the need for capital equipment also declines, right? I mean, this is the scary part for, well, even more so for like machine tool companies or any capital equipment companies, which is if growth rate goes to 0, if you're selling supermarket goods, that means this year is going to be a lot like last year, and you can live with that. If you get to 0 growth and you're a capital equipment company, you basically can see your sales go to 0, because apart from machine broke and now we got to replace a little bit of replacement demand. You don't have any new demand in a 0 growth world for capital equipment. So anyways, but all these things get you right here, Germany and Japan. Someone said oil, Angola. I got that there. So on the whole, pretty good. The only ones that we probably kind of trying to figure out where in the space we are really actually the largest two, Taiwan and South Korea. Ultimately, China may move up, so it puts pressure on those trade surpluses. But at the moment, that kind of regional economy is working, so that actually some of the small little dragons are some of the countries doing the best in terms of the trade in goods of countries.
Apple components are probably half of those.
And Apple components also manufactured in China, but the glue are these Taiwanese and in some cases South Korean companies. You have Samsung Electronics on one side, Foxconn on the other, and so absolutely there is a critical IT supply base that is built that is regional in Asia that's critical to the prosperity of all those countries. All right, that was on the magnitude side. But that didn't give small countries a chance in this game. We're asking, are there any ones that really have good trade surpluses? Well, you had to be a fairly significant economy to be the top trade surplus economy. But if you're trying to think about it as a lived experience for people in a particular place, maybe it's not the absolute number, it's the relative number. And so we went with this one. To say it, I say net exports to trade. Net exports to trade. Really, if you want to think about it, it's a number that it's basically exports minus imports divided by exports plus imports. That's the ratio. E minus I over E plus I. Why is that interesting? Well, it does a couple nice things, right? First, what is its range? It can go from -1 to 0 to 1. All right, when does it hit those numbers? If exports and imports are equal, then it's 0. That's the balanced state. If a country only exports, has no imports, then it's going to read 1. If it has only imports, no exports, it's going to be -1. Okay, so that's the kind of range. That's why it's a kind of useful number. It gives you a sense of, well, what percentage is this kind of trade with China like? And by that token, it's not only Taiwan and South Korea that look pretty good. It's places like Greenland and the Faroe Islands. So you can do well and be small too, at least if you're using the right measure. More interesting is something like a South Sudan, because that speaks to kind of the oil story. And there's some other pieces in there. Switzerland is interesting, and Angola, Oman. Those with, on a percentage basis, really large trade surpluses with China tend to be natural resource rich, oil rich, and we're economies we're thinking about. All right, if that's sort of the positive case, back to the other side, if those are trade surplus countries, what are the trade deficit countries in the world? Which countries have the largest trade deficits in recent years? I've already shown data, so we got to put the United States in there, right? Because I sort of prejudged that I gave that one. Others worth thinking about? Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. Depends if you like absolute numbers or relative numbers, right? India, the UK, Vietnam, India, UK, 30, 40 million deficit. So that's substantial. On the other hand, relative to the United States, nothing comes even to 20% the trade deficit of the United States. So it kind of depends how you look at it. On a percentage basis, sometimes it can be much, much worse. At least most of these are fairly large economies. Sometimes you get small, and roughly speaking, you have some imports from China, and basically there is nothing China wants from you. You have no exports. And then when you get to -1, which some island countries get close to, that's a little bit different. On the bright side, these are small numbers typically in small economies, but
and we don't count some.
But we do count in other ways, and some of the numbers then on trade. If you're looking, the U.S. head and shoulders, okay, so you can kind of understand a little bit of the politics. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but when the United States looks around and says, well, what are our relationships, our economic relationships with China like? It kind of looks to the left and looks to the right and says, gee, there really isn't another country that has quite the same relationship with China that we do. And that can lead to different interpretations of what to do. This is my, well, not really mine, I borrowed it from The Economist, graphical interpretation of what Trump is trying to do, or at least announced that he might be thinking he could possibly be doing at some point in the maybe, who knows, future. What is interesting about this? There are two parts. First, it just gives you a sense of what's being in the conversation right now about if the U.S. is going to slap tariffs on China, where are they headed? If China's going to slap tariffs on the United States, where are they headed? And how much does it matter, in a sense, right? Because the big circles are total trade, total exports from one country to the other. There are only two things that I'd really point out is if you've watched the interplay over the last couple weeks, Beijing, China looks pretty good. I mean, in the sense that Trump gets up and tweets something, and a day or two later, China comes back. And if you kind of look at what Trump was thinking of doing, and you look at, like the first list that China sent, it appears that there's a lot of thought that went into China's first list, right? I mean, this was, what did they put in there when this was, the U.S. said steel and aluminum, we're going to put tariffs on that. What did China come back with? Roughly the same numbers. And they noticed that aluminum was there, so they took about $1 billion of aluminum scrap and threatened a tariff there just to say, we know you're playing in the metals group. But the other stuff, a lot of it was, it was cashew nuts and almonds and some agricultural products, kind of thoughtful ones that you could see, oh, this might really hurt certain districts politically. But the overall numbers, really not that big. And at the end of the day, cashews probably aren't going to have a massive effect on all the supply chains that have been developed in China and Asia more broadly. Consumer product, at the end state, consumers may pay a little more, but you know what? China's whole economic system has been built on making consumers' lives more difficult, households' lives more difficult. So this is just more of the same, and in terms of overall magnitudes, just teeny. Okay. So what do you take away? Strategically, what you can say is, China's pretty good at this. This is not a game. It's like, Trump is bringing a club, and the other person has a rapier or something like that, or a sushi knife or something. I mean, just something delicate. So it's a dangerous game. But the other part of the sense, though, what you'll notice is, all right, this is after, that was the first round. The second round was, okay, U.S. is going to go 50 million in, and China came back with a 50 billion list, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. Still, in terms of the satisfaction of trade policy, China's list is pretty good, pretty thoughtful. Okay, it's not going to matter. This is the thing. And if this debate gets larger and larger, the actual tit-for-tat trade becomes less and less interesting or important, because no matter how strategically smart you are about which industries you're going to put at, if you go another 100 billion into it, what is the list going to have to be for China? All of American exports. That's not a very subtle list, right? So whatever skill they're displaying in how they're sort of picking in industries, over time, if it goes down a road, that goes out the window, because eventually it's everything. That doesn't solve the problem, though. It doesn't solve any problem, and you shouldn't. There's nothing good about that. It just, from a kind of observer's point of view, you just got to notice the subtlety on the trade is going to become less and less important. Okay. But if you're clever and smart about the choices of policy you make, you don't have to just play in the tit-for-tat export game, right? And that's where we're going to see it, right? Because if this thing keeps going, this is why trade wars become so dangerous, because it's not just the tariffs. It's the sense of grievance on both sides that they have been wronged. And once you feel you've been wronged internationally, you can take that in a lot of different directions. Sure, the U.S. might still be playing on the import-exports. Oh, nobody has the right to import or export into a country. That's what sovereignty means. It's a permission. It's an invitation. If you don't like it, we're going to take our marbles and go somewhere else. Yeah, technically, maybe, and maybe we should think, because many countries, and certainly a lot of international trade policy and diplomacy has been built on the idea that countries can kind of divorce trade policy from a lot of other things. That was the whole Seattle riots in the U.S. with the WTO. Was the idea that they two could be so far separate from each other. Well, if you can't play on the export side, well, what do? Play somewhere else where you still have clout, right? Okay. You don't like what U.S. policy is doing on exports? Why not sanction American investments in China already? Make it a little harder if you. KFC is not so important now because they were, but just. Make it a little harder. Or the banks that were thinking that they were going to open up new branches, they're waiting patiently for 20 years for some kind of retail branch operator. Forget it. They'll go backwards. Their GM, they put all their chips on vehicle sales in China and want to be part of the electric vehicle revolution in China, right? No, doesn't have to go that way. And that's where it gets hit. And that's easy because that's on the domestic side for China that's controllable. Then you go to the international side and you say, well, how do we feel about holding Federal Reserve, T-bills, bonds, that sort of thing? It's always, the conversation is, it's too big. If you start selling, you hurt yourself. That's true. But this is what to kind of come down to is, in part, it's not just do you inflict pain, is which economy can survive that pain, which has a higher, pain threshold. On the Chinese side, there's a phrase, right? Sure, okay. And if you feel like that's something that you're used to, then maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter.
Could you wrap up your presentation for the next 5 minutes so we have time for questions?
Last part on trade then is really just trying to put this in perspective. Another way to think about this is on the balance of payment side. There are 4 pieces on the current account. We've talked about goods. We talked about, we haven't talked about the other 3 pieces. There's also services. There's incomes and transfers. Okay. Oftentimes, some of these numbers are small, like transfers, not so big, especially in the Chinese case. Income is interesting. This is where we get remittances. More people are working abroad. There's Philippines, sending money back to the Philippines. So you can have positive on the Philippine side, negative for places like Hong Kong or Taiwan as a result. And that's playing a role. That's in the white. The services is the big story here, which is as big as the trade surplus has been for goods in China. Increasingly, it has a significant deficit in services. And so that's something to keep in mind. What kind of services? There are a lot of different possibilities. It's a broad category. One that's important to keep in mind is tourism. It is now tens of billions of dollars negative. The Chinese tourists abroad sending out a lot more money than foreign tourists going into China. So that's a piece of the story. Why do I mention this? Because if we've been talking about trade, how much does this really matter? U.S.-Chinese trade relations. And I just want to leave you with 2 thoughts on that. One, it's not that important. If China were to find itself with no exports to the United States, 0 exports, how much is that of the Chinese economy is that? It's like 3% of GDP. China is growing at 6% a year. They could take that hit on a 1-year basis, drop it to 3%, and still have better growth rates than the United States. I'm not saying it's no effect. I mean, lose 3 percentage points is meaningful. But still, going from 6 to 3, we're not necessarily talking black hole when you think about it like that. It's just, this is a hiccup. These things happen in economies. On the other side, if you actually think about it in terms of international flows of money, maybe it does make a difference. The trade surplus, if you deduct for the for the deficit in services, you're looking at really the U.S. portion of the trade surplus in goods is well over 100%. And so in terms of balancing your international flows, it would perhaps have an effect. So a couple different ways to think about it. I'm sure we're going to have other perspectives as well, so I'll turn it back to you guys.
Thank you both for your presentations, and we'll start with a question and answer session that I extended to the audience. So for every 1 Chinese woman, there are approximately 1.15 Chinese men. Additionally, the number of China's population above age 60 is projected to increase by 100 million by 2030. So is there a coming Chinese demographic crisis, and how do you think these demographic changes will impact the Chinese economy?
So 2 things. Number one, it's already here in the fact that part of the distortions in the economy is the high savings rate. This is arms racing behavior. If there are more men than women, not all the men are going to be able to marry. So, it's just taken as a given. If you're a guy in China, if you want to get married, you need to have a house and a car. And that's why I tell, my Chinese male colleagues come to New York, life's simpler. No, but that's already affecting things like the savings rates, because whole families have to save for a house for reasons like that. The other reason families have to save similarly is with the aging population, you have 1 kid, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, that's a huge sort of burden for retirement. Couple points. Immigration won't help. If you're South Korea, which has a gender imbalance, people can go abroad. It's a wealthy country. People can find spouses elsewhere. China is 1 billion people plus. So you're never going to shift those numbers. There's no sort of policy tool at this point that will shift anyone. People learn the lesson, and a lot of this imbalance will go away. If you live in a place like Shanghai, lots of people probably realize this already. They're quite happy to have a girl because they see these kind of tensions. But it's too late to have any effect. Same sort of long-term issue, just on the Social Security side. China needs to develop a social safety net to reduce savings. They just don't want to wake up one day and have like U.S.-style Medicare, Medicaid costs and areas like that. Huge growth area, obviously, for those who go back. China is going to need a system of daycare because it's just nursing care. It's just going to be a country that children live in different cities than their parents, and there's just going to be a huge, massive increase in demand for all sorts of services geared towards the elderly.
Just thinking about demographics, maybe three points. One, and this is the one I'm least committed to, but I have noticed and read a couple things that say on the gender imbalance, part of it is just that there are girls who are born that never get reported into the system. And so the question is, how big is the difference? I don't know because I'm not a specialist, but it might be a little bit smaller than some of the numbers show because they're just out-of-system girls that are part of this, well, not really fully part of the story, but are actually present. And that's something to think about a little bit. On the demographic side, on the aging side, really 3 points. One, Japan, Taiwan are places that China will be able to look. They do have an aging question, but there are canaries in the coal mine. There are other countries that are farther along. So the nice thing is they may have a roadmap of things that were positive, useful to do, and other things that, boy, I'm glad they went first so we don't have to repeat their errors. So they will have the benefit of other people's getting there first. So that's there's a relative part to this story that may be helpful to China. That said, keeping on the relative side, just looking at it between the United States and China, that's really important, at least to my mind, because when you think about the aging, you can think about young people, you can think about working labor force, and you can think about retirees. If you compare the United States and China, and you look at it in terms of older people in the society, today's China is comparable to something like 1970s United States. The United States in 1970s had about the same number of old people as a percentage of the population as China has today. So in that sense, the U.S. is, might say far older, far grayer. That's one way to think about it. Looking at the youth of the nation, however, that's where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at children as a percentage of the overall population, China today is where the United States will be in 3 or 4 years. What does that mean in a practical perspective? What it's saying is when you're looking only at the youth of your country, China is an older country than the United States. And so the demographic issue, sure, we think about it in terms of the graying and older folks, but at least in China's case, you see it on both sides, and that's that's important. I think a lot of people know that they may be one of the fastest aging societies on the planet. I think that's known. The idea that China is actually older than the United States in terms of the percentage of youth in the society, I think that's less widely appreciated. So that's something. Lastly, okay, so that's some of the facts about the demographic patterns. What are the implications? The one that I would leave you with is just, it seems to me that demographics are the ultimate litmus test for how successful a financial sector is in the country. What I mean by that is when your workforce is employed and your population in the workforce is getting larger every year, at the end of the day, you tend to have more saved assets at the end of the year than you did at the beginning. And that net increase in savings can hide all kinds of malfeasance, right? This is the Ponzi scheme approach to finance. As long as there's more money coming in today, I don't have to worry about 20 years from now. I can still keep the game going. But when those retirees decide that they're not going to work anymore, and that income's not going to come in, and they're going to have to sell assets to actually pay for their expenses, to eat and rent and things like that, that's the really tough demographic challenge. Then that's when Warren Buffett says, the tide goes out and you see who's been swimming naked. So that demographic change, that transition really does have profound implications for understanding and appreciation for different financial systems. Because that's the one that whether it's the United States or Singapore or Japan or China, that demographic change is a beast that everyone's going to have to face.
Right. So some analysts have seen a sort of death of manufacturing coming in China as the cost of production for low-skilled manufacturing has increased above those of Chinese neighbors. Do you think this is a significant trend? And if so, how will it impact the Chinese economy?
No, I don't think it's a significant trend in the following narrow sense. Wages are lower in Mexico today than they are in China. You think Mexico's cheap? Go to Vietnam. Think Vietnam is cheap? Go to Cambodia. Think Cambodia is cheap? Right? Try Burma. Think Burma's cheap? Try Chad. There's always somebody cheaper. China is no longer competing on wages at all. What it's competing on is a total package in terms of the sheer number of companies, the depth of the supply chain. So that if you need an iPhone case, a laser clicker, a next device, there are 1,000 companies just within 20 miles or 50 miles of Shenzhen that can connect you with it. But what you are seeing is this is where the China 2025 policy and all the strategies to move up the innovation chain are coming. So China's clearly understood that its manufacturing is increasingly automated and that they want to place more of their bets on industries that are capital intensive, that industries that require more skills and training. Think about factories today in the United States. It wouldn't surprise me to see a typical company has 2 engineers for every line assembly worker. Our stereotype was, here's 100 guys who designed the car and 10,000 people who make it. That's swapping everywhere. What it does mean is Chinese companies are going to very aggressively find every piece that is labor intensive that is not subject to automation, and they're going to push it in part through this One Belt, One Road initiative elsewhere. But I don't necessarily think you'll see sort of an aggregate manufacturing decline in the country. You'll just see this steady upskilling in products they make, and then with the products they make, automation even for the same one. I'd remind you as well, we're on the cusp of 3D printing for clothing. I think that's going to be a while. There are lots of people playing with automated robotic sewing and stitching and things like that as well. So we may alter what we think of as labor intensive in future in a lot of industries.
I'm maybe slightly more concerned. I think everything that was said is reasonable. Some of it may prove to be quite significant. Others, plus I don't actually know enough of technologists to know, so that's not really where I come in on it. Comparatively, I just think about some other countries that have gone through that, like a Taiwan or a South Korea. And the good side is they're still there. They're actually wealthier than they were 10, 20 years ago. So it's clear that these are challenges that can be survived, coped with, even done pretty well. So that gives me, so in that sense, I'm there. I don't think it necessarily comes without a cost, but I think it's survivable. When I just go purely theoretical, I'm actually even more strident that there's no problem whatsoever, but that's because I'm being cagey about how the question was posed. What I mean by that is, if you only ask the question about wages, you can't possibly answer the question, because what companies care about are not wages, but value. And the value is a combination of both wages and productivity. And so if you can get more productivity, you don't have to fear higher wages. And so you have to tell both of those stories simultaneously. That being said, I don't think you're getting so much productivity that it completely wipes away the basic question of, can we do labor-intensive cut and sew factories in China, or are we going to do them in Bangladesh or Indonesia? So the question is meaningful, but when I'm feeling a little bit grumpy, I say, well, don't tell me just the wage story. Give me wages and productivity, and then we can have kind of a full conversation on it. Can I throw in one more piece? Because the other side is just, okay, so if I'm already devaluing the wages and labor story because I'm saying you got to do wages with productivity, I want to go one step stronger on thinking about China's economy, which is, when you think about it as labor intensive, there may be a mild misunderstanding of what is truly the significant advantage of China's economy. It's not that the labor is immaterial. I mean, that's the whole part to an export-oriented economy, is you start with agricultural labor and it becomes industrialized, it's relatively cheap, and that's a part of the story. But it's just a part. The other side to it is that to some degree you've seen relatively cheap capital available in China. And so while it may have cheap labor, it may be that cheap capital has been even more powerful a driver of the industrialization. In which case, then it's important to look at I mean, right? I'm suddenly an economist. How many inputs do we have in our equation? We've got labor and capital. Forget land, forget intellectual or whatever else you want to throw in there. We got labor and capital. Here I'm saying, yes, labor a little bit. Don't forget about it. It's one of those pieces. Forget capital, because that may truly be an important part of China's economic development success in the whole model, which is well.
And part of capital is just the sheer quality of the infrastructure. I regularly poll students and I say, who's ever been to China? Who's ever had a power failure? Who's ever seen a 7-hour bottleneck at a port? And I ask, who's been to India or who's been to Vietnam? And virtually every hand raises and says, we've had these issues. China as the total package for manufacturing is really quite remarkable.
So, to the surprise of many, and as you mentioned in your presentation, President Trump is apparently reconsidering entering the TTP. And if the U.S. does come back to the negotiating table, are there any structural adjustments that should be made to the deal, in your opinion, to strengthen or move America away from its interdependence with China? And how effective do you think it would be in delinking U.S. and Chinese trade?
I don't even know what I think about TPP. The way that it's been handled in the last couple of years is such a nightmare from the United States perspective. Plus, just politically, I don't think it's going to fly. His base was basically, let's be careful on trade, and now the trade agreement that he rejected, he's going to try and sell us good. The message is so, I can't. The only positive, I suppose, is for the other countries that are part of TPP, there were some good potential market opening opportunities in the United States, and so those could be, those are not going to be unattractive. Those will stay attractive. But since Trump's whole argument is I'm tougher than the other guys on trade, it seems like there's very small wiggle room, and maybe he's suddenly waking up to like the strategic political importance of TPP, but he's already put his foot in his mouth, and he's alienated people that might have been friends. And trade negotiations, even in the best circumstances, are tough, and you're coming in as a feckless partner. It just seems like a mess.
To put it another way, the issue of whether you could do TPP is entirely one of marketing. It's not one of substance. It's could you somehow frame this and get Fox News, and at least traditional conservatives are still pro free trade, but most of the party is not, to buy into something. But it's not really anything about the substance of the deal, because even if somehow magically people were like, we're so happy the U.S. is back at the table, we're going to make the following 5 or 10 concessions. I don't actually think facts matter in trade agreements anymore. People are just generically for or against. So to me, it's ultimately, it's a marketing challenge. I'm skeptical as well, but we'll see.
And now we'd like to open the panel to any audience questions. So if anyone has any questions, please step up to our microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. I'm Sonia, and I have a question about the shift to the innovation economy in China. So with the Made in China 2025 initiative and others like it, what do you perceive or foresee as being the U.S.'s response to that, or similar shifts to kind of maintain dominance in the technology sector? Thank you.
Well, to go with my colleagues, a metaphor of the rapier versus the bat, this is where I think most people would have focused who are sort of trade experts, in as much as we really do view the U.S. as having a structural trade deficit with 80% of the world. So it just happens to be China's there, but if it wasn't China, it would be somebody else. But where we do know there are real losses is things like the protection of intellectual property. And China quite consciously with this 2025 strategy wants to be a world leader in things like semiconductors. It wants to be a world leader in areas like artificial intelligence, electric cars. And some of those will be zero sum in terms of who are the companies producing this and selling it. So really the core US focus should have been on negotiating, say, the treatment of US companies in China than some of these other issues. Problem, of course, is because that's a core strategy of the Chinese government for the next 10 years. Like that's an area that I think they're actually much more sensitive on than an extra 10 or 20 billion in exports or areas like that.
Yeah. I'm not sure that there's, I mean, I'm not sure that there's a tit for tat or there's a response or it doesn't even, the whole, it doesn't seem like it's looking that way. One thing you can say is, okay, the last $50 billion tariffs that have been threatened against China were built on the idea of intellectual property. And so that somehow fits into a kind of quasi-innovation strategy, because if America's companies that are technological leaders aren't having revenues and profits ripped off, then that would actually leave more money in their coffers, and then they could innovate a little bit better. So that, I guess, is kind of an innovation policy. But I don't think it was in response to 2020, 2025 in China, and it feels much more like it was politically just a partial response to what Trump had promised when he was on the stump in 2016 about how he was going to be tough on trade. So I don't really see, China's doing one thing in terms of government policy towards innovation, and yes, there are elements of American policy that are in like the 50 billion tariffs reactive to some of this, and that's mildly dispiriting, right? Because there's something about speaking to having a vision of positive change, which is much more appealing than just, hey, don't take the stuff we already do well at. That seems, ultimately a losing strategy for innovation. Then the question, though, is if you want a positive vision for change, where should it come from? Do I want Trump telling me what the right sectors of the future are going to be? I'm not sure that would be a kind of pro-government positive story, but I'm not sure that would do us any better. So at that level, then really maybe it's up to the Elon Musks of the world and you guys, really, to figure out what America's proper innovation strategy is by using your youth, your education, and your ideas about what constitutes a good world in the future to get us in the right direction. Because when you are a government or whatever, when you are trying to industrialize, it's a little bit easier. There's a roadmap there of countries that have done it right before. And so it's a lot easier to guide because you have a reasonably concrete roadmap. In the United States, you're at the edge of technological capability. Who knows what the right answer is? There are some people, but it's not typically your government officials. It's probably not even your teachers all the time that know what's going on. Probably the best people are the people in the rooms around you. They have a sense of where the real change is. And so I guess the only thing I could say is try and leave some money in your guys' pockets so you can actually do something meaningful about the world. And that would be an American technological innovation vision. So,
and also just one minor point about measurement. If your goal is to reduce a trade deficit, you can measure that. China could just order some more planes from Boeing. You could put a tariff here or there. All of those kind of existing trade disputes, there's a metric or something you could measure in terms of outcome. How do you measure respecting intellectual property or being more open? It's just really hard to do. Lots of U.S. companies struggle in China just because they're struggling versus somebody else. For many years, I do a case on Walmart in China, and the tensions there are with local governments, and the person who's probably really beating them is Carrefour, a European company. So you can, what that even looks like as a negotiation to be more open or things like that, it can be quite tricky. The U.S. response, actually, which predates Trump with the Obama administration, is just to veto every single purchase of a U.S. tech company by a Chinese firm. Right.
Let's say talk about the trade war between the U.S. and China. It's because the main reason for Trump started this signing the memo is because he basically blamed the U.S. deficit to China. So let's say if China is not the main cause for U.S. deficit, so what are the major causes of U.S. large deficit, trade deficit in the world?
It's a pure function of the gap between domestic savings and the amount U.S. companies invest, plus the amount the federal government borrows. So we sort of teach that often in classes as like an accounting perspective, but it's actually literally the case. The U.S. trade deficit every year is literally that. So let me just tell you two very fast stories that are both true, but I'm swapping the order. Story one is every year China sells more goods to the U.S. They don't buy our goods because our goods are bad or our trade negotiators are weak and dumb or whatever story you want. What's China do with all that money? They just go buy U.S. treasuries with it, right? Same story, flip the order. Americans don't save. American companies like Google and Apple are globally top innovators. They need a lot of capital, or actually it's really ExxonMobil or firms that need the capital. The U.S. government runs deficits. They borrow money. So what do? They go to foreign entities. They go to China. They borrow the money. They give us money. What do we do with that money? We buy their goods. Same story, different order. So, among economists, people view the trade deficit as purely a savings investment story, and they don't view it at all as a competitiveness issue or tariffs or anything else. Because if we balanced our trade tomorrow with China, you would have an equal move in terms of other countries' trade deficits with us growing by the same amount.
So I'll just take that. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because I think there are a few more levers in the balance of payments. But I do think it causes us to focus on a significant issue, which is how do different financial sectors function? And in the China case, I think one could say that they are representative of kind of an East Asian model of development. And the important implications of that is it's been government involvement in a pro-producer kind of business environment. You could say the same thing about Brazil, but Brazil was a lot more obvious. When Brazil did it, basically, the government had high taxes. It took the money from the society and then put it into various industrial policy programs. So it was clear how the money came in, and it was clear how the money went out. In China, same kind of rough thing, but the money comes in three ways. One, wages are not as high as they might otherwise be in different societies. Why is that? China does not have strong labor unions. And so wages are not as high as they might be. So that helps keep business costs under control. There has been a time, I wouldn't say now is necessarily that time, but there has been a time in the last 20, 30 years where China's renminbi has been relatively weak. One way you can see that is just the run-up in foreign exchange reserves. That has helped keep it from being too strong at various times. Right now, take it as a grain of salt, that's not the dominant story. China's reserves were 4 trillion at one point, now they're closer to 3 trillion. So we're in a debt. I'm talking historically here, how they got the economic development was through a relatively weak renminbi. Right now, we're in a different world on that side. And then thirdly, and this is most important, and this goes to the story about savings and investment, which is on the whole, China has had relatively low-cost loans to businesses. And then one of the reasons they could do that is they had very low interest rates to depositors. And so some people might call that, if inflation is high and those interest rates are low, some people will call that financial repression. It's not unique to China. You can see it in Japan and in Singapore and in Taiwan. This is part of the East Asian model, was making it easy for corporate borrowers to have low rates, which would encourage investment, might even encourage overinvestment. And so fundamental to this whole story is how China has structured its financial system in terms of its interest rates that creates relatively cheap capital, which has implications both for China's domestic economy as well as the global economy. So I think that's quite right.
And remember, until recently, with things like private wealth management and some deregulation, every Chinese household essentially got 3% on their money at one of the big banks. That's 3% nominal in return. And in many years, inflation was 5 or 6%. So they're actually putting money in a bank and earning a negative return. Companies were paying 6% interest. Often inflation was 5%. Borrowing a 1% interest, almost any industry can make money. Obviously, a lot of that money then went to SOBs, and that explains the growth of that sector. But going back to Professor Brookfield's charts, the US has had a trade deficit for decades across the world. That clearly has to be a problem or a story about the US. China has had now a trade surplus with much of the world for several decades. That clearly also has to be a story about China. So each country clearly has something domestically going on. When you look at the sheer number of countries and how this continues, and no matter what happens in the US or China, each trend continues in its own country.
So we have time for one more question, if someone would like to.
Can I just answer from here?
Yeah.
So my question is on China's increasingly active role in environmental protection and sustainability, whether it be taking a lead on in the Paris Agreement or the passing of the new and harsher environmental law. So my question is how and if it would impact China's production method and production function.
Yeah. So number one, I think China is being opportunistic, and so two broad explanations. Things like the Paris Accords. This is a sort of cheap way to take global leadership when you know the US is pushing back. But it's also because in kind of an overlapping Venn diagram, China is most concerned about domestic pollution, like air pollution, but also water. And it just happens to be the industries that are creating that pollution and smog are also creating carbon emissions for global warming. So the real focus to me is bringing up the level of pollution down. And I always say in consistent service in China, what are the number two complaints? Corruption and pollution. And obviously the anti-corruption campaign is addressing one. They need to bring that down. There's also a clear sense that many of the industries that are polluting are less attractive ones, that China is just less invested in the future. So they're willing to sort of shut those down. But there's real change. Like I have students researching the Chinese paper industry for a course, and one of the consistent messages I keep getting is the number of firms that are like having to shut down, move, or alter things to sort of bring those down. But it strikes me as it's primarily a domestic story, and it's purely in the self-interest of the government to do so.
I think there are a number of different environmental challenges, and I think China's meeting some of them better than others. I think some are more difficult than others. I'll start with the negative. The one I think is going to be a real challenge, and I don't think it's easy to solve, is just the question of water, and especially the question of water availability in China over time. I think that's going to be hard, not only because of the question of polluted, but just the use. And then you think about new industries in certain sectors, like, oh, if you're on the energy side, you're thinking about in the United States, they've had kind of a shale gas revolution. Would that be helpful or hurtful to China? On the energy side, it's still a fossil fuel, so it's not ideal, but it's still cleaner than oil or coal. So it may have a role, at least in the intermediate position. On the other hand, these sorts of things also require water. Water in places where the shale resources are, is really, there's often not a lot of water resources. So some of the technological futures are going to be tricky because of this. You look at different provinces and you realize that on a per capita basis in China, a lot of provinces in China have about as much water as they do in the Middle East. Okay, not every country in the Middle East, some are even drier, but there are countries in the Middle East that have, on a per capita basis, about as much water as some of the larger, more populous provinces in China. I think this is underappreciated, how significant and severe the water challenges are going to be. I think those sorts of things could be hard. On an international level, this is where you're going to potentially see conflicts, because where you have the Tibetan Plateau, you have a lot of rivers there. There are technological engineering solutions, but they come with sort of international political costs. So how all that plays out, I don't know, but I see that as a challenge. On the other side, there's some really optimistic pieces. The two that I see are both electric vehicles and solar panels. And I say that not just because they're useful on the environmental side, but they are so right on the business strategy side. Okay, if you think about running a country and having a positive balance of payments, having your current account be positive, this can be a real challenge sometimes. It doesn't always have to be, but sometimes it's actually really helpful for a country for that to be. One of the big movers on current accounts is automobile vehicles, imports and exports. And China comes in, they're late to the game of automobiles, and their indigenous gasoline combustion engine products are okay. but they haven't. They're not clearly superior to the rest of the world. But if the rest of the world goes from combustion engine to electric engine, well, suddenly that's a technological shift. China could be a leader in that. And that can change the entire dynamics of that industry. So not only do you solve an environmental problem, you also provide a business opportunity. So I see that one as pretty encouraging. On the solar panel side, same thing. A number of the technologies behind solar panels are not so dissimilar from what you might see in chip making. And certainly, to go upstream, China would like to see more sophisticated chip technologies. So again, not only does it solve an environmental problem, it also is kind of a business strategy solution to some issues. So in some places, I actually am pretty optimistic. So overall mixed, but there's some nice spots.
I've just been informed that we actually have time for one more question, so someone else would like to.
Thank you so much for coming. I want to raise attention to one company called Huawei, which is one of the biggest telecommunication equipment maker in the world. In recent months, we see growing fear of that company in America. The Congress, Pentagon, and FCC has laid out new regulation and restriction on Huawei. The four biggest carriers in the US and Best Buy has all shared its tie with Huawei. So what is the pattern we're seeing here? Do you think the America's fear of Huawei is justified?
From the U.S. perspective, the U.S. government, even though Huawei is not an SOE, it's a private company, is absolutely convinced of this. They've hired former U.S. generals and admirals to be their lobbyists and consultants in the U.S., and the U.S. government is not only preventing Huawei from selling phones in the U.S. I mean, originally it was like switchgear, which is much more sensitive than phones, because, well, I know the U.S. apparently put stuff in our switchgear we sold to people for surveillance. We're also actively lobbying other countries not to adopt Huawei, not their phones, but like their telecommunication services. We lobbied Britain, they did it anyway. But like we told South Korea, don't install this, it's a security threat. So this is a company that the US has gone out of its way to sort of particularly target. And as a result, like Huawei phones, they're making great phones. You're just not gonna see it anytime soon. And what's also weird is that then hits the US where four companies essentially are, four carriers control how you buy cell phones in the US uniquely, because we have this weird model of embedding it in your service contracts. So they're very frustrated. I've gone there, I've talked to people who are there, I've taken students. I don't see any change anytime soon.
There were two parts to the question. One is, how do I see things? I have no idea. I'm not a specialist. I have zero idea of whether they should be thought as risky or not. It's not just the United States. I know Australia has the same kind of question. So I don't think it's purely a U.S. China thing, but I have zero idea. But just in terms of more of a domestic political analysis, do I see a change happening anytime soon? I think Joe's probably right. I don't see it immediately on the horizon. There's only one irony in all of this stuff. Is I think their best penetration has been in relatively rural parts of America's telecom system, which is also probably the Trump base. So the one that's perhaps most inclined to fight for it, fight against it, is also the one that has allowed it to if it's a problem, it's also that community that's allowed it to penetrate the United States. So I mean, there are some contradictions and paradoxes here. I have no idea how they get resolved.
Thank you.
All right, well, that wraps up our panel for today. So it's a big thank you. I believe we have some gifts.
Oh, thank you.